Sparta never lost a war of arms. It lost a war of numbers. For 300 years, the most feared soldiers in the Mediterranean marched into every battle certain their formation could not break. And it didn't, not at Thermopylae, not at Plataea, not even at Leuctra, where history finally proved them wrong. But the true collapse of Sparta had started decades earlier, quietly, in the empty cradles of Spartiate households, in the shrinking rolls of citizens eligible to stand in the phalanx. By the time Sparta's enemies discovered how to defeat her on the battlefield, the city had already defeated itself off it. This is the story of how the most rigid, most disciplined society in the ancient world destroyed its own foundation, not with an invading army, but with land laws, birth rates, and a caste system so narrow that eventually there was almost no one left to be Spartan at all. This is part one of a three-part investigation into the fall of Sparta. A fall so slow that Sparta's own citizens spent most of it insisting nothing had changed. The word Spartan has survived for 25 centuries as shorthand for something almost superhuman. Discipline without complaint, strength without softness. A society that turned human beings into instruments of war so effective that a mere 300 of them, fighting alongside allied Greek forces, could hold a mountain pass against the largest army the world had ever assembled. That story, the stand at Thermopylae in 480 BCE, is the image most people carry of Sparta. Indestructible, eternal, immune to the decay that swallowed every other Greek city-state in turn. It is also, in the most important sense, wrong. Sparta did not fall to Persian arrows or Athenian ships, or even to the disciplined spears of Thebes, though Thebes would eventually deliver the blow that broke Spartan military supremacy for good. Sparta fell to arithmetic. It fell to a demographic collapse so severe, so specific to the peculiar way Spartan society organized property, marriage, and citizenship, that by the 4th century BCE, the city that had once fielded 8,000 full citizen soldiers could barely muster 1,000. This is not a story about swords. It is a story about numbers, and about what happens when a warrior state realizes, too late, that it has spent centuries carefully engineering its own extinction. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the foundation of the system itself. The reforms attributed to the semi-legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, who according to Spartan tradition reorganized the city sometime in the 8th or 7th century BCE into the rigid military machine history remembers. Under this system, land, the only real form of wealth in an agrarian society, was allegedly divided into equal plots, called kleroi, distributed among Spartan citizen families. Each kleros was meant to produce enough grain, wine, and oil to support one Spartan household and free its head from labor entirely, so that he could devote his life to war. The land itself was worked not by Spartans but by Helots, a subjugated population, generally understood to be the descendants of conquered Messenians, bound to the soil in a condition of state-owned serfdom that Spartan citizens maintained through ritualized terror, including the secret police-like cryptia and the annual formal declaration of war against the Helot population itself, a legal fiction that meant a Spartan citizen could kill a Helot without committing a crime. This system was built, from the very beginning, around a fundamental numbers problem. Herodotus and later Aristotle both note that the Helot population vastly outnumbered actual Spartan citizens, likely by a ratio of 7 to 1, or by some later estimates even higher. Sparta was, in effect, a small occupying military caste sitting on top of a subject population that despised it, a population it needed both for its labor and its constant vigilance against. Every Spartan boy raised through the brutal state education system known as the agoge existed for one function: to be part of the force capable of keeping the Helots down while also fighting Sparta's external wars. The entire structure of Spartan citizenship depended, from the outset, on the ratio between free citizens and landholdings remaining stable enough that this system of terror-based control could hold. It did not hold. The Spartans called this citizen class the homoioi, the similars or equals, a term that captured the ideological core of Spartan identity, that every full citizen was, whatever his birth or wealth, formerly the peer of every other in the collective mess halls, the citizenship, where citizens ate together as a mark of shared status and mutual obligation. But underneath the ideology of equality sat property law that, by the 5th century BCE, was doing exactly the opposite of what it claimed. Sparta permitted land, unlike in many other Greek states, to be inherited by daughters as well as sons, and it allowed heiresses to consolidate multiple kleroi through marriage and inheritance. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century in his Politics, is scathing on this point specifically, describing how nearly 2/5 of all Spartan territory had, by his time, come into the hands of women through inheritance, dowries, and the deliberate concentration of estates among a shrinking circle of wealthy families. Why does this matter for a military caste system? Because Spartan citizenship was not automatic. It had to be earned and maintained continuously through participation in the citizenship, and participation required a financial contribution of food and wine from one's own kleros. A Spartan who could not pay his mess dues, because his land had been divided among too many heirs, lost to debt, or simply never large enough to begin with, was formally demoted. He became a hypomaions, an inferior, stripped of full citizenship rights while still nominally free, still Spartan by blood, but permanently excluded from the political and military class that defined what it meant to be Spartan at all. This was not a rare edge case. As land increasingly consolidated into fewer and fewer hands, through the same mechanisms of inheritance, dowry, and elite intermarriage that concentrate wealth in most agrarian aristocracies, but accelerated in Sparta by its unusual inheritance rules, the number of citizens able to maintain full Spartiate status collapsed. The numbers themselves are almost shocking in their trajectory. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, Sparta is recorded by Herodotus as fielding 5,000 full Spartiate hoplites, alongside an equal or greater number of allied and Helot-supported troops. This was Sparta near the peak of its available citizen manpower, a force that, combined with the broader Peloponnesian League, allowed Sparta to lead the Greek alliance that finally broke Persian ambitions in mainland Greece. It is worth sitting with that number, 5,000 full citizens under arms, because it is the high water mark against which everything that follows must be measured. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, barely a century later, the number of full Spartiates able to take the field had fallen to somewhere near 700. Different ancient sources and modern historians debate the precise figures, and Xenophon, our closest contemporary source and a noted admirer of Sparta, is understandably reluctant to dwell on the scale of the decline in his own writings. But the broad direction is not in dispute among historians. A citizen body that had numbered in the thousands during the Persian Wars had shrunk, within a handful of generations, to a group so small that the city literally could not replace losses on the battlefield. This phenomenon has a name in modern scholarship, oliganthropia, scarcity of men, and Aristotle uses this precise term when diagnosing what he considered the terminal weakness of the Spartan constitution. What caused a citizen population to fall so far so fast, in a society that prized martial reproduction and framed childbearing as a patriotic duty? The land concentration problem was the primary driver, but it compounded with several other structural features unique to Spartan society. The agoge itself, the brutal state upbringing that took boys from their families at age 7 and subjected them to systematic deprivation, ritualized violence, and constant testing, was lethal in ways that other Greek states' more conventional childhoods were not. Ancient sources describe boys dying during ritual floggings at the altar of Artemis Orthia, a practice that, whatever its original religious purpose, intensified over time into something closer to an endurance spectacle, particularly under Roman influence in later centuries, though its earlier classical-era form was already dangerous enough to shrink the pool of boys who survived to citizenship. There is also the matter of Spartan marriage customs themselves, which discouraged early and frequent reproduction in ways that ran directly counter to the state's professed need for soldiers. Spartan men did not live with their wives even after marriage. A citizen continued residing in the communal barracks with his age cohort until age 30, visiting his wife in secret, often literally under cover of darkness, a practice multiple ancient sources describe as being maintained for years even after marriage. Plutarch records that this system was intended to keep sexual passion inflamed and marriages fresh, but the practical effect, combined with late marriage ages for men typically around 30 and continuous military and communal obligations, was almost certainly lower fertility than a more conventional household structure would have produced. Meanwhile, catastrophic events like the Great Earthquake of 464 BCE, which ancient sources claim killed enormous numbers of young Spartans training together in communal facilities, could remove a large fraction of a single generation in one afternoon, a demographic shock a small citizen population could not easily absorb, unlike Athens, whose more diffuse and much larger citizen body could sustain equivalent losses without threatening the entire system. Meanwhile, the wars themselves ground down the very manpower the system depended on. The Peloponnesian War against Athens, lasting from 431 to 404 BCE, was fought and eventually won by Sparta, but victory itself accelerated the crisis. Every Spartiate lost in battle was a citizen who could never be replaced through normal reproduction fast enough, because the birth rate among the shrinking citizen class was already too low to offset combat losses, and because, critically, Sparta had almost no mechanism for creating new full citizens from outside this closed hereditary caste. Athens could grant citizenship, however rarely, to foreigners and could rely on a much larger free population to fill its ranks. Sparta's entire ideological structure depended on citizenship being an inherited, nearly closed status tied to land ownership and mess hall participation, meaning that the system had no flexibility to absorb losses by expanding who counted as Spartan. The city had built, deliberately, a caste so exclusive that its own success in war became one of the mechanisms of its demographic destruction. By the early 4th century BCE, Spartan kings and ephors were fully aware of the crisis, even if Spartan public ideology resisted acknowledging it. A notorious law associated with the ephor Epitadius, passed sometime around 400 BCE, is described by Plutarch as having formally permitted Spartan citizens to give away or bequeath their kleros freely, rather than requiring it to pass through the traditional inheritance structure meant to keep land distributed among citizen households. Whatever Epitadius's original intent, historians have long debated whether this law caused the land concentration crisis or merely legalized and accelerated a concentration that was already well underway through generations of intermarriage among Sparta's wealthiest families. Either way, the effect was the same. Land, and with its citizenship, funneled ever more tightly into fewer hands, while the ordinary Spartiate family found itself unable to maintain the property threshold required to remain a citizen at all. By the time Sparta faced Thebes at Leuctra in 371 BCE, the city that had once been synonymous with invincible infantry could field a citizen force a fraction of the size it had commanded a century before, forced increasingly to rely on allied troops. Mercenaries and even armed helots granted a form of conditional freedom in exchange for military service, a desperate expedient that would have been unthinkable to the architects of the original Lycurgan system. The defeat at Leuctra, at the hands of the Theban general Epaminondas and his innovative oblique battle formation, is remembered as the moment Spartan military supremacy ended. But the truth, as this documentary series will show, is that the battle was less a cause of Spartan collapse than its final public confirmation. The city had been hollowing out from within for nearly a century before a single Theban spear ever crossed a Spartan shield. What makes this story so striking to historians is precisely how invisible the crisis was to contemporaries, and how visible it is to us in hindsight, once the numbers are laid side by side. Sparta's own ideology, its cult of secrecy, its refusal to permit written records of its laws, its studied indifference to how the outside world perceived internal Spartan affairs, meant that the demographic collapse was rarely discussed openly even as it was happening. Aristotle, writing from Athens a generation after Leuctra, was one of the first outside observers to systematically diagnose the crisis in structural terms, identifying the land laws, the inheritance customs favoring women, and the closed nature of Spartan citizenship as the specific mechanisms of decline. His account, preserved in the Politics, remains one of our best windows into how a state built entirely around the concept of eternal military readiness quietly ran out of the one resource it could never manufacture on demand: Spartan citizens themselves. The numbers were already collapsing, but Sparta's enemies were about to discover something the Spartans themselves had refused to admit: that an empty citizen role and an unbeaten reputation cannot hold a battle line forever. Part 2 begins on the field at Leuctra. In the next part of this investigation, we turn to the battlefield consequences of this quiet collapse. How a shrinking citizen body forced Sparta into military reforms, and eventually into humiliating dependence on the very helot population it had spent centuries terrorizing, and how the crisis at Leuctra unfolded not as a single tactical failure, but as the last card a hollowed-out state had left to play.